Hello and welcome to CISPRO training. Today's topic is components and constituents. So what are they? Chemical, biological, and supply materials in CISPRO can be made up of multiple components. So let's say you are a lab worker. You're tasked with mixing a couple different acids together, maybe some water in specific proportions. You're going to create some new mixture. You need to define this mixture in CISPRO, and the way you would do that is you would create a new chemical record and you would build out each individual component that makes up the mixture. So how much of acid A did you put in, how much of acid B, how much water, so the percentage of the overall mixture, and which constituents make up these make up the mixture. So constituents would be the actual materials that go into building this mixture, and a component record in CISPRO is kind of that junction between what's the constituent, acid A, and how much of the mixture does it make up, and what is the mixture that acid A is going into. So each chemical, and again biologicals and supply materials in CISPRO, can have multiple components defined, and these components basically indicate what has gone in to make up this blend or this mixture material. So each material component record consists of a few things: the percentage of the mixture that the component makes up, and or the concentration. So we'll see how both of those things work in the actual interface momentarily. We'll get a chance to indicate whether a specific component is the active component of our mixture. So this is useful for reporting. If you indicate a component is the active ingredient, you could then roll that in as a filter or use it in different reports or views to show, to indicate such, or to show only the active components that you flagged as being active. And there's also a checkbox we'll see to indicate whether the component should be included in hazardous reporting, such as the out-of-the-box Tier 2 and HMIS fire reports. And as I alluded to earlier, each material component record points to a constituent material. So you think there's kind of three things going on here. At the top, we've got the mixture material. So we're going to create a chemical record to define this thing we're mixing up on our bench. What are we making? That's going to be our top level chemical record. That's going to be our mixture record. And then at the low end, we've got the constituent. So my mixture is going to be made up of, say, 3 different ingredients or 3 different chemicals. Each of those will be a constituent that is then mixed in a certain proportion to make up my mixture. Well, the material component record is that junction, what goes into the mixture, and then how much, what proportion, what percentage, what concentration. So the material component is kind of that middle bridge between the constituents and the overall final mixture material that we're making. So some things to note. A material will be flagged as belonging to a regulatory list based on the properties of its components. And what this means is, and if you're not too familiar with regulatory lists, there is a separate training session on that topic on the materials inventory community, but we can define a list of CAS numbers, for instance, or we can define a list of trade names or a list of some other property to tell CISPRO, hey, anytime you see a chemical created that has one of these CAS numbers or matches one of these trade names, flag that chemical as belonging to this regulatory list. This is typically used by customers to keep a closer eye on certain regulated materials. Maybe they're highly hazardous materials that they have to be able to report on and say, how much of these materials do you have at any given time? Or they might just keep a closer eye on expensive materials they work with. Well, regulatory lists are a way to group those chemicals together automatically, but it's important to know that if a chemical has a component that matches one of these identifying properties on a regulatory list, the overall mixture is going to be flagged as belonging to that regulatory list. And this is important because a customer may need to manually exclude a material from a reg list. So let's say we've got a list of very highly hazardous materials, and there's certain CAS numbers that make up that list. Well, we happen to build a mixture that's got a very, very small percentage of this highly hazardous material. So that highly hazardous material is a very small percentage. It's a component of my overall mixture. well, automatically that mixture is going to be flagged as being this highly hazardous material. And that might not be the case. It might be such a diluted amount that it's no longer hazardous. We no longer need to treat it specially. We're just going to make sure we remove that mixture from the purview of this regulatory list. That's something that users need to be aware of, is that the components they are looked at, and they can be the reason that a mixture is flagged as being on a reg list. It's important to note that materials other than constituents may be used as a component. So in an earlier training session about material types, we indicated there is a material type out of the box called constituent. And it's really a pared down version of a chemical material type. Well, in previous versions of CISPRO, I think up to 2018 SP2, a material component had to be selected from this constituents list. We had to define our constituents as the constituent material type, and those were the only materials we could pull in and make a component of some sort of mixture. Well, as of CISPRO 2018 SP2, any other material may now be used as a material component. So we can never introduce a single constituent record into our system, and we can still take our chemicals. So maybe we've got a nice comprehensive list of chemicals in our library. Well, we can select any of those chemicals and use them as a constituent or a component of another chemical that we're defining. Therefore, it's important to note that materials, say a chemical that itself has components, that's made up of various components, that record can be used as a constituent or a component of a new mixture. So we get this kind of notion of a hierarchy, and we'll take a look at this in the interface. But we can take chemical A, which becomes part of chemical B. Chemical B is this mixture containing a few different chemicals. Well, down the road, we can use chemical B as a component of some third mixture. So we're not limited to being able to do that, as we may have been in versions past. All right, and now to take a look at the interface and how all this works. I'm going to load my list of chemicals. We're going to look primarily at chemicals here, but know that those other material types can have components. And you see right out of the box, we've got this Components tab. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time here. But first, I'm going to define a new mixture that I'm going to create. So we're really going to start from scratch. And I'm going to first start and say, I'm going to create a chemical. And let's say in this chemical we're going to have two different acids and some water that all go in to make up this particular mixture. I've got this recipe I'm following. Now, total caveat, this may not be chemically accurate, so bear with me. This is just to show the functionality and how it may work. So let's say the mixture I'm creating is going to be named perchloric acid 5% in acetic acid. Well, something like that. My supplier, we'll just say it's going to be in-house because I'm building this thing on my own. It's a liquid. We satisfy our requirements. So what we can do here is we can define our primary mixture material, and we fill in as much information as we have. One of the things we can do on this page is to identify our components right here as we're creating this material. The other option would be to kind of flesh out the skeleton, the trade name, the supplier, the physical state, the specific gravity, submit this, save this record, and then we can go in and flesh out the components or our other data fields after the initial record has been created. And we'll kind of look at how both of those things work. For now, let's start with just adding our components right here as we're defining our mixture material. So we've got two options. We can add a component by the percentage of the mixture that it makes up, or by that component's concentration, and we'll take a look at both. But I click the Add Percentage Component button, and it gives us a few fields. So first it wants to know, what material are we using for this component? What are we pouring in our mixing bowl as we make this mixture? And we can pick from our list of constituents. So we do have that material type called constituent, and there's nothing wrong with using that, but those are our options. We can pick from that list, or we can pick from our overall list of materials. And these will be things like our other chemicals and biologics and supplies. So let's say first I need to add my acetic acid. So I do a quick search here. It finds I have a chemical with that name. I select that as my constituent. And here I have a few fields I need to flesh out. What's the lower percentage? Greater than or greater than and equal to, greater than or equal to a certain value. So we might not know exactly how much is going in as I'm mixing this. We might have a range of percentages. So I can do something like the lower range is going to be greater than or equal to 80% of the mixture, and the upper bound will be something like 85%. But I can also identify the target. So what we're really shooting for is we want our perchloric acid to be 85% of our overall mixture. And we can define all three of these, the lower, the upper, and then our precise target percentage that we're shooting for. And here, as mentioned earlier, we've got whether this is the active component, yes or no, whether this should be included in hazardous reporting. So whatever might need to be here, we can also leave those fields blank if we need. They're not required. So now I've defined that, hey, 80 to 85%, targeting 85% of my mixture that I created, or that I'm creating now, this perchloric acid and acetic acid, 85% is going to be acetic acid. And now maybe I want to add a second component, but we're going to do this one by concentration. So a slightly different look. It still says, well, what are we adding? It can be a material or a constituent. In this case, I'm going to grab my perchloric acid chemical. And in this case, instead of a percentage, we can also work by concentration. So assuming 1,000 grams per liter represents 100% of our mixture, we can kind of use that to derive our percentages. So if I say, well, the perchloric acid is going to make up 50 grams per liter. Is it active? Is it hazardous reporting? Whatever we need to select there. Again, just another way to define the proportion of our mixture that each constituent makes up. So with that all done, let's save our record and see what the result looks like. This is now going to go and create a new chemical record. It'll add it to our list of chemicals that we should be familiar with by now. So if I go and load my chemicals page, here in my list of chemicals is that mixture I just created, perchloric acid 5% and acetic acid. If I go to my components tab, I'm going to see a couple things. I can see the components that make up my material. In the first case, we did not indicate a concentration of acetic acid. We went straight to the percentages. So if I expand my columns here, we'll see, there's my 80 to 85% with a target of 85%. Because I used concentration, it calculated the percentage based on that concentration quantity amount that I put in. So we've got we're targeting 90% of our mixture we've made up of these two acids. Well, I forgot to add water. That's going to be the last part of my mixture. So let's go ahead and add that now, which I can do from here. So because I've already created this mixture chemical record, I'm not going to do this on the create material page. I'm not going to go back and try to reload that. I simply add a new material component from the record itself. And that gives us a slightly different look. And we've got a couple additional options here. So it might be best to flesh out these components this way. Create the material first, then go to the Components tab and add each constituent here. Because we get a box here that we did not have available on the Create Material page. So here I can say, okay, I know the mixture I'm making up. The last thing I need to do is put water to kind of fill out, get me to 100% being made up of all my components. Well, in this case, I have a constituent. So again, I have the same options, material or constituent. In this case, let's stay with constituent, and I actually have one in my system defined called water. And here I could put the percentage. We know we're targeting 85% of acid A, 5% of acid B. I could just put, hey, we want water to make up the other 10%. But it's an opportunity to look at this last field on the interface here, QS, which is Latin for quantum satis, which means basically the amount which is enough. So that's another way to just say, if you tick this box for a component, and a mixture can only have one component, that is the QS component, that's going to calculate and fill up the rest of our mixture. So because we had targeted 85% of one component, 5% being made up of another component, selecting water as the quantum satis constituent basically just brings us up to 100%. It found the difference between what we've targeted and 100%, which in our case was 10%, and now it says that that's the amount that water will make up of our mixture. So one of the examples I had in the slide deck we were looking at was using a material that itself was made up of components as a component in a new mixture. And I believe I've got one in my system here. If I look at, yes. So I've got this particular chemical in my system. And if I stay on the Components tab, I can see a few things here. I said, again, not going for chemical accuracy here, but I said the components of this product or this material are acetone in a certain percentage and water in a certain concentration or percentage. And now a third component is text mixture A. Well, if I look at test mixture A, and I drill down to what that is, that's actually just another chemical in my system, and that test mixture A has components. It's made up of, well, two of the ones we were just working with, acetic acid and perchloric acid. So this material itself is made up of components. So if I go back a couple of screens to the mixture I was just looking at, well, because one of its components up here in the top grid is a mixture with additional components, now we can see the breakdown here at the bottom in this all constituents grid. And for some reason in my display, I've lost my column headers here, but you can see where we have water and acetone up here, we've got water and acetone here. Well, it breaks down this component that is itself made up of two components. So here, instead of test mixture A, I can see acetic acid and perchloric acid and the overall percentages. So because this mixture, we're targeting, say, 15% of our mixture we're dealing with is made up of this mixture, well, it actually breaks down the percentages. Well, because that mixture is only 15% of our overall mixture, that means that 1.5% of the overall mixture is perchloric acid. 14.25% is acetic acid, and then we've got our acetone and water. So as we go through this hierarchy of materials made up of components, then making up components of other materials, we can see the breakdown of all the constituents and in what percentages make up our overall mixture. And this is useful for reporting. This might be useful for maybe controlled substances where it's very important that we see a particular constituent is a controlled substance and it went into several different other mixtures that ultimately ended up in a final product. Well, we still want to be able to drill down and see what percentage of that final product this constituent uses, even if it's several levels down the hierarchy. So that is components and constituents in a nutshell. Thank you for your time and attendance today, and we will see you on the next training session.